Good afternoon. Welcome to APTN InFocus. I'm your host, Melissa Ridgen. Statistics Canada's numbers from 2011 show almost half of Indigenous people aged 25 to 64 have post-secondary education, but the majority is in trades or college diplomas, and only 10% have a university degree. Some suggest it's because these hallowed halls of learning are unfriendly places if you're Indigenous. So today we're putting that in focus, and we want you to join in our conversation. Our phone lines are open. You can call us toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. You can also tweet us at APTN InFocus. Before I introduce you to our guests, here's a story we did when classes commenced this fall, and a poster riled many at the University of Manitoba.
Multiple posters saying it's okay to be white were spotted around the University of Manitoba campus Thursday morning. Now leaders on the campus are condemning acts of racism. University of Manitoba Student Union President Jacob Sanderson says they don't know who's responsible.
This message is troublesome to all people of color and all marginalized communities on campus.
The It's Okay to be White slogan originated from an online message board. It's intended to provoke a strong reaction with a harmless-sounding message. Sanderson says the posters were faxed to the Department of Women and Gender Studies and the Department of Native Studies. Ashley Daniels and Brendan Wood are both part of the Indigenous Student Association. They say the doors and walls of the Native Studies department were plastered with the posters.
It's just scary that this is happening, and it's clear there's a clear target.
Honestly, I'm not surprised. There's a lot of racism that's going on, and it's gotten to a point where I don't feel safe as an Indigenous student on campus.
Sanderson says the University of Manitoba isn't the only campus to be plagued with these posters, and is encouraging students to come forward with concerns.
It's our job right now as the leaders on this campus to be listeners as much as it is to be actors. So certainly we want to try and take action to address this, but perhaps even more importantly, we want to listen to students' concerns.
Ashley Branson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Joining us now in studio is Kevin Lamoureux. He's the Associate Vice President of Indigenous Affairs with the University of Winnipeg. Dr. Barry Lavallee is the Director of Student Support and Education for the Centre of Aboriginal Health Education. And joining us from the Native Centre at the University of Calgary is Michael Hart. He's Vice Provost of the school's Indigenous Strategy. Thank you guys all for joining us. So we'll just start with what's really basic here, that story we just showed. From your respective campuses, is it really, are you hearing it's really a dangerous place to be Indigenous? We'll start with Kevin.
Sure. First, let me say that it's such an honor to be on the show with Barry and Michael. Talk about standing on the shoulders of giants. And I'm not saying that they're older or that I'm younger, but I am saying that I certainly appreciate the pathways that were made possible by people like this.
Yeah.
Historically speaking, universities, as a microcosm of the rest of society, are not safe for Indigenous people. And I think if we look honestly at the history and the inheritance of the broken relationship, the universities have been absolutely complicit in the exercise of colonization. Many of the mindsets and decisions that were made began in those hallowed halls that you talk about. And so when that student very bravely and very courageously stands up to talk about how they feel in response to that, and it's important to me that we honor the students, and what a burden it is to carry that on top of all of the responsibilities of studying and getting papers done, to feel threatened because of who you are. I give them nothing but credit. But when they talk about this idea of it not being safe and not being surprised by that, I think it's because of this history that we have inherited and how it reflects larger society and that experience for Indigenous people.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we think of universities as places where that should be the first place you'd see change, but it's not necessarily working out like that. Dr. Lavallee, what do you hear? What do you see? I mean, you're at campus, you hear from people. What do you see and hear that would, are people safe? Do they feel safe? Do they feel it's a welcoming place for Indigenous people to study?
I mean, I think it, because most of my work is around actually supporting self-identified Indigenous students seeking careers in health, sciences, medicine, nursing, etc. But the odd thing about Indigenous-specific racism in institutions like the University of Manitoba is that it manifests in various ways. So one moment a student perhaps might feel that I'm part of the system, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be a nurse, and then suddenly something changes unexpectedly. like a comment made in your class, a comment by your faculty, a comment by a patient, that really represents a racial microaggression. And so racism is not like a blatant 1950s. It's okay to be white phenomena that occurred at the university really should be a little bit more honest. And it should read, it is advantageous to be white, would be much more correct in looking at an analysis around race and racism in a healthcare system. So what we want to do in my position, and I'm a senior doctor and a mentor for Indigenous students, is that we want to facilitate an education where they have to contend with violence. And still to become a doctor, still to become a nurse, still to become a dentist. And while that sounds really odd, it's not black or white. It's actually a myriad of things, of experiences that can happen. And the most difficult thing for self-identified Indigenous students I work with at the RADI Faculty of Health Sciences is for them to be able to name the phenomena, to recognize the phenomena, and to locate it in such a way that it doesn't, as much as possible, disturb their ability to get the exams done, write their papers, do all those kinds of things. So our students have to contend with 2, sometimes 3 things at once, never mind trying to get be successful in a degree.
Well, there would be, I mean, this "It's Okay to Be White" poster, there's suggestions that it's actually advantageous to be Indigenous because everything is handed to you. This isn't the experience that you see or hear as being a reality in.
Yeah, I mean, it's okay to be Indigenous, indeed, if it was. But I think most of settler Canada, and anybody who's not Indigenous in Canada, in my analysis, is a settler, whether they've been here for 200 years or for a day. Settler Canada is only created to make sure settlers get the very basics of things, while most of our people don't have physicians. They're politically and socially constructed to be poor and not to gain access to universities. One time a colleague of mine said, "I wish I had a treaty card." I said, well, that would be fine, because I'll give you a treaty card and I'm going to send you in the same economic unviable situation many of our First Nations patients come from, and make sure that you actually can't take a plane out of an isolated area. And you'll see what advantages there are to being First Nation in that context. So it's part of the phenomena of perpetuating stereotypes in order to maintain the status quo in settler society. And our institutions are complicit in that same propaganda about what's true or not true about Indigenous peoples.
Mr. Hart, I'll turn it over to you. What's is it a safe place, University of Calgary, for Indigenous students to go and learn? What do you see and what do you hear?
First of all, I think we need to look at a broader picture, that universities are a microcosm of our society, and to suggest that any place in society has a sense of safety to it for Indigenous peoples without understanding that history and the current realities will be naive. So with that said, we're aware of that racism exists here at the University of Calgary. When we were initiating our process to develop our strategy, we came front and center to some of these matters around racism in of itself. So we know that it exists here and that it's present. So it is, as such, it's a matter that we're trying to address head on. So the strategy and our efforts right now include looking at this matter of oppression that Indigenous peoples face and trying to determine a process that will address it, as well as provide that safe space, or what we often refer to here as that ethical space, where Indigenous peoples could flourish and achieve their own goals and visions. So we're not naive in terms of the existence of racism present here. We know that this isn't something that's happened before. We know that it's present in and often unconscious, and sometimes unconscious, or in ways that are hidden, in the same way that the whole comment, "It's okay to be white," hides racism. So people who are unaware of the background of this phrase, "it's okay to be white," would often not understand the history because they haven't investigated. In the same way that there's people here who may not understand the history of the oppression of racism that Indigenous peoples have faced and continue to face, and as such don't have an understanding of why we're trying to create change in this way. So a lot of our efforts brings this up front, and we acknowledge it, and that we're trying to determine the best ways to go forward in addressing it while creating that safe space for Indigenous peoples.
What is the difference? I'll ask you, well, we should qualify, you were talking about the strategy that's at the University of Calgary. This was, I believe it was a year ago that the University of Calgary said, we need an Indigenous strategy. And you guys just recently, I think it was last week, just did a progress report on that. Maybe you could just give us a little bit of a glimpse as to what the intent of that was and where you guys are at.
So it was actually 3 years ago that the efforts to try to develop a strategy was initiated. And through the guidance and support of elders in this region, the university took on a process, a longer term process, which ended up being 2 years long, where we had input from a number of areas, a number of the nations around here, but for certain from people within the university. And through this process, we recognized the need for a parallel process. And it's phrased this way to emphasize it isn't about assimilating or to try and bring Indigenous peoples within the university's mainstream ways of doing. It's a recognition that it isn't about that. It's about recognizing and supporting and respecting that Indigenous peoples, non-Indigenous peoples, we have different ways of going forth, and we want to be able to respect this parallel way of going forth. So our strategy was approved from the Board of Governors as well as throughout the university a year ago, and so we just finished a year report on the strategy. So part of this strategy includes, for example, an education component to inform people within the university, and indeed we want to reach beyond the university to the surrounding community in the region, to inform them about the colonial history, about such things as racism, such things as implicit bias, and such things as discrimination that's used to pull people down. So our strategy is trying to look at the development of ways to educate people and to change things within universities. So it's looking at policies, it's looking at creating safe places and places where Indigenous peoples can recognize themselves and see that they have just as much right to be here as any other person. And so that includes the incorporation of our knowledge bases, includes creating that safe place where we address issues such as racism head on, and that we are wanting to create that safety so that we're all contributing and all receiving from within the university.
Okay, well, we're going to go and take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to talk to you all about, what is, this is all part of reconciliation. This is, what's the difference between indigenizing and decolonizing, if there is a difference, what needs to be done, what steps are being taken, and where there still needs to go. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, but stay with us because this conversation is nowhere near done. We will be back after this short break. Join our conversation now. You can call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like and watch us live on the APTN News Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus, and send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Hello, welcome back. Let's go to social media now to hear what some of you are saying about today's topic. Have you experienced racism as an Indigenous post-secondary student? We have Glenna, who wrote in, I was the only Indigenous person on campus. I even got into physical fights. I'd like to know more about where that was and when, if we're talking recent history or long ago history. Thomas had to say back in the day, 30 plus years ago, it was more of an issue with the paper-pushing control freaks, the bureaucracy, the colonial holdovers. My classmates and instructors were fine. Lillian, From the no-brain profs, yes. I love some of the comments we get on social media. And from Victor, disagree. I graduated in 1966 and had no experience of racism. Also would like to know where Victor went to school. Richard says, all Indigenous people have. Evidence is in the policies still being followed. Definitely, it's a no-brainer. If you would like to add your opinion to the topic of conversation here, here's how you can do it. Join our conversation now. You can call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like and watch us live on the APTN News Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. So Indigenous leadership in Northern Ontario say Lakehead University has to address its racism problem. Angelique Eaglewoman was the dean of the university's law school. She resigned, and she says because of the racism and apathy at the school. She's now suing for $2.7 million. APTN's Willow Fiddler explains.
Angelique Eaglewoman announced her resignation last month. Now, First Nations and Métis leaders are standing behind her in support.
I speak strongly for, and I'm very disheartened that we have lost a very strong First Nation woman leaving the organization here today, and we'll be very vocal to the Board of Governors on addressing this issue coming forward.
In a letter to the Aboriginal Advisory Committee in March, Eaglewoman said she had been the victim of systemic discrimination because she's Indigenous and a woman.
From the very beginning of my tenure as dean, I felt that there were certain staff and faculty members that were very resistant. And over time, I began to see the systemic racism and called for cultural competency training within the Faculty of Law. And then I began to experience from the senior administration that they didn't see it the same way and they weren't going to support me in those efforts.
Eaglewoman was appointed dean of the law school in 2016. She said staff and faculty resisted to her efforts of doing things like reaching out to First Nations high school students in Thunder Bay and holding a conference on Indigenous law practices.
So in doing those types of things, I was criticized as only focusing on the Indigenous law mandate. And again, that idea that somehow this was an add-on and not a central part of the fabric of the law school.
Deputy Grand Chief Derek Fox from Anishinaabe-Aski Nation says that the Indigenous mandate and its Indigenous partners are the reason the law school exists in the first place.
You know, they use that mandate to get these law schools. They use that mandate to create these two schools on the basis of First Nations beliefs. And it seems to me that once these schools are created, they want to get rid of those teachings.
In a letter to the university's Board of Governors, First Nations and Métis leaders want to ensure that the next dean will be Indigenous and that there is an Indigenous seat on the Board of Governors going forward. Willow Fiddler, APTN National News, Thunder Bay.
We conducted a poll on Facebook asking, have you experienced racism as an Indigenous post-secondary student? 81% of respondents said yes, 19% said no. And is there overt racism on campuses that you see, or is it something more insidious? I'd like to open that up to our guests. Who wants to start?
I'll start. First off, I want to say how much I appreciate the Dean from Lakehead being included in this conversation. I was remarking during the break how much I love listening to Dr. Lavely and Mark, Dr. Hart talk about the things that they're talking about. I wish I could take notes while I was listening to them. The student in me is so intrigued. But I think that both of my brothers would acknowledge that this conversation is incomplete without hearing from women and the experience of female students on campus, which is a completely different set of challenges altogether. And so I really appreciate hearing those voices included with this. In answer to your question, I think it's both. I think that we have inherited this wreckage, this legacy of colonialism, and this reality that university was complicit in this. But I also think that it is very much overt at times, and I think that it's very important to listen to the voices of these students and really listen to what they're saying. I mean, if 81% are saying that they've experienced racism, I think it's irresponsible and immoral, to be honest with you, to ignore that voice, to pretend that that voice could be mitigated by some other factors, or to wish away those sentiments. Those are things that have to be listened to. And I think it's really incredible to see the footage of the way that the communities surrounding Lakehead came together to support this academic, this woman, to stand in solidarity with them. I think that that's beautiful to sort of recognize the strength that Indigenous people have when we stand together and share each other's voices and listen to one another. I think that that's inspiring, and I think now is the time to really listen to the experiences of students.
Have you've been at the University of Winnipeg for how long?
Most of my adult life. I almost can't imagine life outside of campus, to be honest with you.
So have you seen, has there been an evolution?
Absolutely, absolutely there's an evolution. I think that one of the things that's leading this change is universities and people in universities being able to recognize that we have inherited this wreckage of the past, that through no fault of our own we've become part of this system that has been guilty of contributing to the marginalization of people, and that in our roles now, these places of privilege, that we have an opportunity to dismantle and sort of decolonize some of those structures, those systems, those bureaucracies that students are telling us about on social media. University of Winnipeg itself, before I came in as Associate Vice President, Indigenous Affairs, had committed to indigenization. And this is a word that's recognizable across Canada.
Right.
This commitment of universities to be a part of indigenization.
I don't think people know what it necessarily means, though. It's a word that we know, that we hear, and it sounds like it's something positive, but are you seeing it in application?
Well, I got to be honest with you. As the administrative lead of that initiative, I don't know what it means either. And when I came into that position, I really had to think good and hard and openly about what indigenization might mean to me. I understand that it's a Western word. It implies that we're trying to accomplish something. It implies that we're on a journey, that we're trying to change something. I get all of that. But in an actual functional, practical way, what does that mean?
Right.
I know as a fact that there are many knowledge keepers that reject that term completely. You can't make something Indigenous that isn't. And so what I did when I came into my position, I humbly approached people that I trust, names that you would recognize out there in the community, and I asked them for their guidance to help me understand what this word indigenization might mean. And uniformly, everyone that I spoke to, and it was quite humbling to get this feedback, whatever indigenization might mean, it has to include the concept of safety. That indigenization means safety in the process of facilitating safety and accomplishing safety for Indigenous students on campus, recognizing that historically speaking, universities, like the rest of Canada, have been unsafe for Indigenous people. And I'm not just talking about physical safety, which would be the bare minimum. It makes me want to cry when I hear that statement from that student saying that they even had to get into fistfights to come to school and be a part of campus. Breaks my heart. But it's also safety of identity, it's safety of cultural practice, it's safety of cultural ways of being, it's safety of Indigenous knowledge on campus, it's safety of human remains, it's safety of artifacts, it's safety of providing safety for grief. For many of our young people, they will learn about how things came to be in a university setting, why things are the way that they are. And to provide places for responding to and healing from trauma, I think is part of the responsibilities of university, recognizing that they were part of the process and creating those in the first place.
Dr. Lavallee, you've, and maybe people watching our show who don't focus on Winnipeg news a whole lot because we are across the Turtle Island here. Dr. Lavallee has been fairly vocal in some of the things that you would like to see happen at University of Manitoba that haven't. Can you share with the rest of our audience? Because you're not happy about it.
Well, no,
to say the very least.
Yeah, I mean, I think incrementalism, or just doing small steps towards a final goal, I think is disadvantageous to Indigenous people. And I want to just say a thing about racism and how it looks. In the classes I teach in the medical school, and quite typically with other providers, we do case studies where clearly it's racism that's contributed to the death and or morbidity, like the illness Indigenous people may find themselves in if they seek care in a healthcare institution. And one of the things we attempt to do in terms of knowledge and skills is to support students, future doctors, et cetera, providers, to articulate how they would address Indigenous-specific racism seen in a healthcare setting or in a clinical environment. And a phenomena that occurs is a response, I'm not sure because I'm worried about my career. I'm not sure because I'm worried about hurting the feelings of my colleague who expressed a racist comment or action. And so you have to think about what this really means, this kind of void. Where people wouldn't declare openly, immediately, that this is wrong and this is something we shouldn't progress with in a clinical setting. But this is the state of racism in such a way that it appears innocuous in a response that I don't want to offend anybody, I don't want my career to be stalled because I'm actually supporting an Indigenous person who's experiencing racism currently. Now that's not only medicine to give them a little bit of off right now. This occurs in education, it occurs in child family services, the justice law, across all institutions that represent what's we call settler Canada. So if you can't see that there's a wrong being done at the moment it's being done, that is how racism looks. Okay, you have to think about that, okay? Because what ends up happening as an educator, I mean, my expertise is in adult learning theory. That's what I studied.
Right.
But I've never been taught as a teacher how to actually fill that void or to support somebody to move forward. So you have to think of Indigenous-specific racism as one of a panel of events that can occur in an institution, including gender violence, homophobia, ableism, all those kinds of things are linked in a pattern where in fact at the top of the hierarchy in social society are white heterosexual males, as an example. And as we move down, you'd find Indigenous people at the bottom. And there are a lot of authors, social sciences, not medicine, social sciences authors who actually make claims that Indigenous peoples indeed are not even viewed as human. And if they're not viewed as human, then it becomes the frontier state. And in the frontier state, medicine is not prescribed, there's no justice, you can't protect the Indigenous body. So in that phenomenon, when you look at that particular phenomenon in terms of settler Canada, then things become very predictable about what responses you have or what responses you don't have to address Indigenous-specific racism in context.
Dr. Hart, I want to hear from you what, in the context you've heard what Mr. Lamoureux and Dr. Lavallée have said here. What is your school, what are you seeing happening at your school with regards to the implementation of this strategy that was developed a couple of years ago?
So the strategy was developed this past year, so we're just in our first year of it. Right now we're in the process of figuring out the best way to reach the largest number of people within the university, both the students, staff, faculty, and trying to educate them about indigenization, about racism, as well as this parallel journey that we're on. I think one of the things that we want to make sure that's included in such education efforts, indeed across the country, is the whole piece about how we understand indigenization. And I think there's some limitations in just the concept in of itself. The tendency is that indigenization can easily become something such as window dressing. In other words, you have your posters here, you may have a particular cultural event there. And the limitation with this kind of focus on indigenization does not address structural issues in terms of, for example, how are decisions made, who are the people making the decisions, who are the people implementing the decisions, what are the micro decisions and who are implementing those, who's creating barriers or maintaining barriers for Indigenous peoples. When indigenization ignores all that, then it becomes something what I've referred to in a process or a workshop that I've done years ago, is that it's window dressing. And if we're going to move away from window dressing and to understand indigenization in a more impactful sense, then the gaze has to switch from looking at Indigenous peoples in terms of an object of study to understanding how those in positions of power are able to utilize their power and rely on the limited information they have, whether intentionally or unintentionally, rely on that information to maintain the power structures the way they are. So in other words, are we indigenizing in a way that we are trying to help settler society come to a deeper understanding how their own values, beliefs, practices, thoughts get implemented at the expense of Indigenous peoples, including Indigenous lives? unless we're able to recognize and switch that gaze so that it isn't focused just on Indigenous peoples, but on the relationship between settler society and Indigenous peoples, we're going to continue replicating window dressing. And so to truly indigenize, we have to look at these power structures and shift that power so that there's a shared process where both peoples are able to walk forward. In addition to that, then, we also have to pay attention to this history and indeed the current utilization of racism as a means to maintain the structures. We have to look at that and how it's created this position for settler society to be in an advantageous state, and that if we really want to be able to walk in terms of equity, we have to recognize the amount of support and resources for Indigenous peoples to work in a safe place, in a safe space, with their own ideas, practices, etc., and to make sure we put that extra effort to address the oppression utilized by settler society. Unless we're able to give a significant attention to both these matters, we're going to continue to have indigenization reflect window dressing.
Which leads me to another question that I had for Dr. Lavallee, but I know we're running short on time for this segment, so I'll save it for when we get back. Okay, we need to take another quick break, but when we come back, there's going to be some students that we're going to talk to about what life is like if you're Indigenous in a university in Canada. Stay with us. Hello, welcome back. So it's not just about indigenizing the curriculum. Many Indigenous students say that they feel they're in a hostile environment when they go to college or university. Here's a look at a story that APTN's Tina Roche did in 2015 when vandals destroyed an art exhibit at the University of Acadia on missing and murdered Indigenous women.
What's missing here are 10 vibrant red dresses. That's because they were stolen. The dresses are part of an exhibit by Métis artist Jamie Black. They symbolize the 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Because to me it removes, in some respects, some of the great work that Jamie Black did. But there's also a great irony that an exhibition that is exploring missing and murdered Aboriginal women, that the destruction of that has also spurred a wider discussion.
The dresses were hanging outside, secured tightly to the branches of a tree. But shortly after the exhibit opened back in September, one of them went missing, and eventually all 10 vanished. These two were anonymously donated in recent days.
It's kind of heartbreaking, and you want to be able to actually do something about it, but you can't. What you have to do is get people to talk about it, and once again bring it back to the exhibit.
Jamie Black began the Redress Project 5 years ago. It's traveled across the country. The red dresses are now on display at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. APTN couldn't reach Black for comment, but others here were surprised that the exhibit outside was totally destroyed.
I couldn't believe the ignorance, actually. You know, again, we're a university campus, liberal arts undergraduate campus. Wolfville's a fairly progressive town. I didn't understand why this was happening. I understand there's always, a few people who maybe are ignorant or don't understand things, but this seemed sort of, the extent of it was really disturbing.
Soklovsky talked to his classes about it and wrote an opinion piece. He says, if nothing else, this spurs on the conversation on a difficult topic. Dunseith is organizing an event to do just that.
We need to talk about the issue, and as well we need to bring it back to a positive message of what the exhibit is trying to do here.
She says the empty red dresses highlight the disappearance of Indigenous women, and the vandalism only amplifies the issue. The student-led talk is planned for November 13th, and the Redress Project is on display here at the Art Gallery until the end of the month. Trina Roach, APTN National News, Wolfville, Nova Scotia.
So even more recently, there was an offensive Halloween pumpkin that was left in front of the Native Studies building at the University of Alberta. The pumpkin was decorated with feathers and had scratches on the face to look like war paint. University officials threw the pumpkin out, but students say this isn't the first time they've had to deal with racism on campus. Cassidy Hallcrow, Vice President of the Aboriginal Student Council, had this to say.
And we're really upset that something like that would happen. But it's not something that we're not used to. We've had our own lounge. We've had it completely ruined on the inside. And we don't know who it was because there's no security around here. It's completely vandalized, and we've had our teepee vandalized. And, you know, you'd expect these events to not be happening on campus anymore.
Joining me now, we have Evan Jamieson Eckel. He's joining us from Brantford. He's an Indigenous Studies student at McMaster University in Hamilton. And Amanda Enns is the manager of the Native Centre at the University of Calgary. She's joining us as well. And we still have Dr. Lavalley in studio with us. I want to just circle back to the first story that we saw when we came back from the break with the missing red dresses. And we'd heard somebody say this is ignorant and maybe they don't understand what they were doing. And we were discussing during the break, they knew exactly what they were doing, is your hypothesis. And it wasn't ignorance, it was hate.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is fanciful for us to discuss in terms of addressing racism against Indigenous peoples is the idea that a lack of knowledge is really what is the forefront. I think historically, although I'm not a historian, the establishment on Turtle Island is marked in red blood. And the estimates are from 30, 40, up to 100 million Indigenous peoples within the first 100 years of contact were starved, lost their life to disease, or actual out genocidal processes.
Yeah.
And, you know, like the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is a function of that same process. And when people actually feign ignorance about that, ignorance originates from Canada. Canada perpetuates the lack of knowledge or the lack of action that we see on racism. The issue about racism against the Indigenous body in Canada is not for me, nor you, nor anybody else to address. We just simply don't have the power to make changes. We could highlight things repeatedly, but people actually target us. Okay.
And that's targeting. I don't believe that those dresses disappeared. That somebody
intentional targeting, and the message is that it's not important that Indigenous women are murdered.
Precisely.
And assaulted repeatedly in Canada today. And so I think we have to get away from that kind of holding hands kind of issue. We don't have the power. We can highlight. But it's actually up to settler Canada, to white society in Canada, which includes settlers of color, to make a decision about their positionality in the context of the ongoing violence towards Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Yeah. Evan, I want to go over to you. Evan is very active on social media about his experiences as an Indigenous student at school. I love your posts. Well, I shouldn't say that. I love that you're that open about what you see, what you experience. Some of them are heartbreaking. Give us a little bit of a sample of a day in the life of you as an Indigenous student in Hamilton.
I just want to say first too, like I'm speaking from my own experience. Other students probably don't have the same experience that I do. But over the past 6 years, I can only describe my experience as nothing short of a nightmare. So in class, it seems like an effort to embrace truth and reconciliation. It's been made more palatable for non-Native students, and particularly white students. And this is Indigenous studies as well. This is not just amongst in other classes like biology or like labor studies or that sort of thing. This is the Indigenous studies department. And so what's been going on with me is the struggle between what Michael Hart was talking about, like systemic racism. So you have a system that promotes individualism. And what that does in our university has Indigenous students fighting one another for positions and to get sort of fame behind their name. And then you also have the dual problem that our classrooms are more about coddling white guilt than being about Indigenous liberation. And that's the formation of Indigenous studies. And instead, there's these people coming in, taking up space, sometimes literally crying. Like in my one Indigenous medicine class, there's a girl who started crying and well, doesn't even ask, and she yelled at Prof, who was an elder, when are we getting to the herbs? Then we also have non-Native people becoming TAs for Indigenous studies courses. So we have white people and non-Native people dictating and marking Indigenous knowledge, dictating Indigenous identity. And then we have the dual problem of Indigenous services there not being for all Indigenous students.
You've in your criticism of the school, you've actually said the Indigenous staff helped this all to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So like there's space made for more for non-Indigenous people than Indigenous people themselves. There is infighting going on between students. I've seen it myself. Some of it's gotten physical in the past years, but more now than it was before is more of rumor spreading and that sort of thing. Dr. Barry, or the other person you had in speaking on this issue, mentioned how we're supposed to be stronger when we're united. But we are in an environment where individuals get the same benefits over and over again. And like it's not about a collective success, but people being encouraged to fight one another with arguments and lateral violence to get ahead for themselves. Like, so you have things like missing and murdered Indigenous women. Why can't we all have a voice on that? People want to be have the claim to be leaders. And there's nothing else besides that.
Amanda, I want to go to you now. So the University of Calgary, you're part of this Indigenous strategy that they've been working on. I had to get it sorted out in my head. They came up with the idea to do this 2 years ago. They started doing it a year ago. Now we've just had a progress report on it. What have you seen in terms of change or lack of change since this strategy was put in place?
Thanks, that's a really great question. I've been part of the University of Calgary as an undergrad student prior to the strategy. I was a grad student while the strategy was being developed, and now I'm a staff here at the University of Calgary. So I've seen how it's progressed, and I've seen some of the great changes that have happened as a result of the strategy. I think all of the things that Evan is talking about are stories that we would hear from students as well. My position is really closely connected to students, and so I have the opportunity to have a lot of great conversations. Some of those are really difficult conversations where Indigenous students are talking about blatant racism that's happening in classrooms. It could be with peers, it could be perceptions of racism with faculty, or it could be just feeling singled out in the classroom setting whenever an Indigenous topic comes up. Then the student becomes the teacher, and there's a bit of a power imbalance. So one of the great things about my role is that I have the opportunity to really get involved in being part of a positive change on campus. So when those sorts of stories come my way, I have the ability to work with advisors to make sure that they're providing support to students in the way that they need. Sometimes that is being in a place where students can have a safe conversation. Sometimes we need to have conversations with deans to determine if inappropriate conversations have happened in a classroom. Sometimes we need to have conversations with students about making protected disclosures, because that's a process that we are able to go through here at UCalgary. To support not just Indigenous students, but all students who are feeling unsafe or unwelcome, or who are going through situations like Evan described.
So you've seen it improve.
The strategy has been really, absolutely. And I think there are instances where we've seen it improve, and I think that there are instances where we continue to hear about racist comments, racist issues, and we work through them on a case-by-case basis.
I want to go back to Dr. Lavallee, to something, well, actually, that Mr. Hart said before the break about you have to change the power imbalance. You have pretty strong feelings about how that has to be done.
Well, I think, you know, the universities across Canada can continue to put money towards the establishment of Indigenous-specific offices of support. And I don't say this lightly. But if it doesn't address the origin of where the violence comes from, then you're just developing systems to support people while they actually have to attend to racism they experience. That fundamentally is a problem. A number of us at this university believe that in the end, a person should be held accountable to his or her behavior if they exhibit racism against Indigenous people in a very structured format, with at the end being fired and removed from their position because of racism.
And you've asked that the president of the university should be removed from his position, you've said.
Now,
this has happened under his
yes,
rule, so...
Yeah, absolutely. But if we don't change the system by which presidents are allocated that very privileged position along with the Board of Governors, we will do nothing. The comments I made, white society took them very differently. That statement I made is metaphorical. So it is, I'm just saying that if we removed and addressed the white patriarchy in the university and replaced the positions with power with First Nations or Métis women, and then supported them accordingly, that is about the equal distribution of power and opportunity to make the universities not only good for Indigenous people, but everybody else will benefit, including white people. Because when racism exists in a society, it's not only the targeted people or race, but everybody else diminishes in that same society. And I think fundamentally people have a hard time understanding that, because we use the dichotomy or the binary, right, white settler or settler of color and Indigenous people. But through our whole society, we all suffer from the impact of racism.
Yeah. Evan, what do you want to see happen? What needs to change? You're in the classroom, you're there every day, you're not done your education, you're continuing on, possibly not at the school you're at, but a different one. What needs to change from your perspective as a student?
For Indigenous studies itself, it needs to be refocused back on Indigenous people, period. Instead of it being about coddling to, like, again, white fragility, effectively, it needs to go back and put primacy on Indigenous students. That means the teachers should be there to help Indigenous students too, and not just academically. There should be there as kind of like mental health supports and that sort of thing as well. Because we don't know where Indigenous students are coming from and what point of time they're at in their life when they get to university. Who knows what they're going through? And so, like, these teachers, if they care about our futures and stuff, as much as they say that they do, they can use all the buzzwords in the book, but if they're not actually there for us, they're not supporting us and actually helping us go at each other's throats, then what's the point?
I wonder, do you think that there's this, you refer to it as coddling white liberal guilt. Do you feel from Indigenous teachers at the school that they feel like they need to encourage, this is how they encourage people to take an interest in Indigenous studies and Indigenous history and the Indigenous reality, and it's just, they're misguided in their application of wanting these people to stay interested? I want to know, like, where does it come from?
I think that does play a part, because I've heard complaints from white students in the past that said, oh, this teacher was too harsh in the past, like, oh, they're too angry. So now they have, like, new people teaching the Intro Indigenous Studies course, it's not so hard-hitting. But also, I think they're maybe afraid to kind of push back. Like, whether it's fear for losing their job, or fear from interacting and saying no to a student in the class. I don't know. I think there could be many reasons for that sort of thing.
I feel like we've just kind of got into it, and it'd be nice if there was, then go to a deeper level and involve some of these people who, if you could name names and cite examples and have them in to explain why they do what they do. Okay, that is about all the time that we have for today. I'm so happy that you could join us in studio, Dr. Lavallee. Evan, that you could join us from Brantford, and Amanda, that you could join us from Calgary. I'd like to thank Mr. Lamoureux, too. He had to take off to another appointment. Mr. Hart, thank you for joining us as well at the University of Calgary. I hope that our topic today has got people thinking and talking, and that the dialogue continues well after the show. Thanks to all of our guests for sharing, and to all of you for watching. This episode will be available for download as a podcast on our website at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Melissa Ridgen, and I will see you back here tonight for APTN National News.